Kathy?
Thanks, Ken. I wish my mother was here to listen to that. So, welcome to all of you, and sincere thanks to Trent and Judy for all the hard work you've put into the program, as well as the program committee and the board at AAEEBL. I'm delighted to be here, and I hope that we'll have an opportunity to go on a bit of a journey together this afternoon, or this morning, on a slightly different approach to thinking about what kinds of processes, what kinds of cognitive processes e-portfolios can promote. So I'm going to start with a quote from Michael Wesch, who was the 2008 Case Carnegie Professor of the Year. And he says, our schools are generally still organized around answers rather than questions. And that really struck me, really poignantly, because I realized through all my years of teaching, and also in working with students at Brown, and also faculty at Brown, that students, particularly today, are overachievers, and they're so stressed out in making sure they get the right grade and they go to the right institutions, so that, I think that they haven't thought that part through yet, because they're so busy jumping through hoops and making grades and getting those assignments in. And they don't take pause to think about, really, what are my questions, and what matters, and how do I know, and how do I put this all together? And so what I've been trying to do is get students to really live the question. And how can e-portfolios allow that to happen? How do we, as academics, as institutions, and societies, think about creating frameworks for allowing students to take pause and really interrogating meaning out of all of the courses that they're taking and all the assignments that they're engaging in? And so I'd like to posit that learning spaces, or e-portfolios, I should say, are learning spaces for metacognition. And by learning spaces, I mean learning spaces at large. They can be physical spaces. Their learning spaces can also be electronic spaces. But they should also be social spaces. And so what are the ways in which we can think about the e-portfolio as a venue for creating the habits of mind that can happen in these kinds of spaces? So the key ideas I hope that you'll take away are to validate uncertainty as a crucial element of lifelong learning and inquiry. And think about the collaborative e-portfolio, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that notion of collaborative e-portfolio, as a developmental learning space for metacognition and the formation of one's disciplinary identity. And I think many of us think about that. When we're teaching our courses, when we're in the academy, we think about, well, I want my students to think like a scientist. I want my students to think like an economist. I want them to develop and cultivate those habits of mind and expertise that will allow them to be whatever it is that they're going to move on in their careers. But if that's what we're trying to do, then where's the space for reflection and metacognition that allows them to think about, well, what is it that I'm engaging in that allows me to develop those critical thinking skills, those analytical skills, in which I'm trying to understand what scientific inquiry is all about. And then I'd like you to think about the process of transformational learning through what we call transitional experiences across a process of collaborative inquiry. And by collaborative inquiry, it could mean within a discipline, or it could mean across disciplines. So metacognition, the definition that I'm using, is that of Flavel, who worked on this in the 70s, in simply thinking about one's own thinking. And so that includes the process of planning how to approach a learning task, and monitoring one's comprehension, and evaluating that process along the way, and one's progress in learning. And these are easy to just list and say, yes, we do metacognition, and our students do this. But what's your evidence? How do you know? What does it look like? And for the students, how do they know? Are they actually aware of this happening? And how do you make this visible And very importantly, how do you teach this? How do you integrate this into the curriculum? So one of the influential works that have come out here in the US by Bransford and colleagues, which many of you know about, published by the National Research Council, How People Learn, talks about the key issues that are important in getting our students to really learn. And one of the key issues had to do with metacognition. And How People Learn went into great detail based on thousands of studies to show that a metacognitive approach to instruction can help students to take control of their own learning by defining their learning goals and monitoring their progress in achieving them. And so based on How People Learn, many organizations like the NSF and the Howard Hughes Medical Institute and other kinds of funding agencies have decided, well, what are the ways in which we send out grant initiatives and have institutions convince us that these are the ways in which they're changing their curricula so that students can develop these practices and recapacitate the ways in which we're cultivating or educating our students in higher education. But I'm not sure we're there yet. And so if we go back to what someone earlier had mentioned about George Koo and the ACNU high impact practices, amongst them include the process of collaborative learning and authentic inquiry. And these elements, amongst that long list, are really, really important, particularly in early years of the undergraduate education, in imposing that high impact for students to engage in the process of deep learning and deep engagement. But I would say that through this process, it's also critically important to integrate the process of metacognition. Because if they don't think about what it is and the ways in which something is effective or not, while they're engaging in authentic inquiry or collaborative learning, then they haven't really been monitoring their process of learning. So I'm grateful to Brett and Laura yesterday for framing this week or this conference. And I'm particularly struck by one of the pieces that they mentioned, which is really, really critical in what can e-portfolios do. And that process of reflection in community, the social pedagogy, is an incredibly powerful opportunity for students to engage in the process of collaborative inquiry and reflection and metacognition through this process. And being aware of their own positions in relation to the social pedagogy that's happening and the ways in which they're monitoring their progress, or when they come up against a bottleneck, when they come up against a challenge, what is it that's happening and how are they aware about whether their learning processes are or are not working? And what does that mean in that social context? What are the ways in which they're negotiating and interrogating their assumptions together in collaboration with their peers? And finally, what does that look like? So, Sabin Baden has talked about learning spaces as opportunities to reflect upon and analyze one's learning positions. And that's a really, really important aspect of thinking about learning spaces, because we rarely think about students' learning positions. And by learning positions, I mean the ability to identify those transitional moments where perhaps you're not quite fully understanding, or you haven't really figured it out, or you haven't really identified your understanding in relation to the work at hand, but you're okay with it. It's a cognizance, it's a metacognition of saying, I don't quite understand. This is what I'm aware of. And I recognize that these are the gaps in my understanding. And I have a map, a cognitive map per se, of where I am in this process. And how am I making these connections? How do I need to recalibrate the connections I've made thus far to really understand where I am in this process? So what do these learning positions look like? And what are the ways in which collaborative portfolios might make some of them visible, not only to us, but to our students? And how does that help them develop some of these lifelong learning skills that we've been talking about? Barnett talks about knowing as the position of realizing and producing epistemological gaps. I find this to be a really intriguing definition because we think about knowing, as certainty and understanding and conclusion. But the notion of thinking about knowing as realizing where our gaps in understanding are is critically important, because if we don't understand that, then we actually don't have a metacognitive process in place in understanding the hows and the whys and in what ways. We just know about the whats. And therefore, this kind of knowing produces uncertainty, and uncertainty is very, very uncomfortable. It's incredibly uncomfortable for students, and we don't reward uncertainty, certainly not. We don't give A's for uncertainty. And we actually wouldn't even know how to grade it if we saw it. But how do we value that? How do we take that and say, okay, we're going to take this process and work with it and create a scaffold where the students struggle through these thresholds or these bottlenecks and develop an understanding and the ability to learn. So I'd like to talk about the Eportfolio as a collaborative learning space, a space that validates uncertainty, and it allows students to discover their learning positions and allows them to live the question. I'm going to talk about a case study that I engaged in for several years while I was an academic at the University of New South Wales. And there I taught microbiology for many, many years. It was introductory microbiology. It was a required course in the curriculum. And because it was a required sequence in many of the life science majors, it wasn't necessarily what all the students wanted to be taking. Those students who wanted to be majoring in the marine and biological sciences wanted to be out there frolicking with dolphins. They didn't want to be sitting there in the laboratories drinking microbes out in a petri dish. So it was my mission as a microbiologist to convince them that this was one of the best courses, that how could you not love microbiology? With 280 students, 8 a.m., lecture hall. We had 2 lectures a week, a recitation section, what we called a tutorial, and a laboratory that was associated with it. The labs and recitation groups were linked, and there are about roughly 12 to 15 students per group, and each group had a TA or a tutor. And over the years of teaching this course and revising it and tweaking it and wanting every student to walk out of there thinking, I want to be a microbiologist, I started to get troubled by what we in the academy were teaching as what we believe was the process of scientific inquiry. Because oftentimes what students perceived to be the process of inquiry was because of the ways in which the courses were designed, and often the textbooks were designed, and what we rewarded them for. And they seem, in the early years, they seemed to miss the whole point of why all of us who became scientists, because we were living the question. They thought we were living the answers. Because what happens is, when you ask them, what's inquiry about? And these are straight out of different textbooks and different kinds of websites that talk about inquiry. Sure enough, all the elements are there. The process of observation, posing a hypothesis or a question, and developing or designing the methodology, collecting your data and analyzing it and discussing it. But what happens is, it's linear. It all leads to the same thing. There's a conclusion. There's this eureka thing. And students think this is what science is about. That you just wake up every day and say, I'm going to go discover something. And it's going to be a positive result, whatever that means.